Welcome to Outlaw Bookseller with me, Stephen E. Andrews, a writer, bookseller, collector. And I say collector, but there's going to be some changes on that front. And I always say writer, but I've not managed to do any writing for ages. Nothing that's led to publication because I haven't been able to put time into it. Largely because I've been running a YouTube channel. But we'll come back to that another time because that is going to change. On the collecting front, that's where things are really going to change. I'm not giving it up altogether, but it is going on hiatus. There are several reasons for this. There is money, because it's an expensive hobby. There is space, for as I've said many times, I have a small home. There's also availability. The remaining things I like are mostly hard to find. When you do find them, they're expensive. They have to be in the right condition. And there's also the factor of age. I'm not getting any younger, and time is growing shorter. So I'm not saying I'm giving up on collecting altogether. It is just going on hiatus. However, it's also entering a new phase where, because of the conditions I've just described, there will be less to buy. The other day you noticed I reviewed the new Adam Roberts novel, and looking forward over the next few months at new books coming out. Because I work in a bookshop, I'm always tempted because I'm surrounded by things all day, and I do like ideas, so naturally, you know, there are always temptations. It's always been that way for 40 years. So I'm looking forward when I retire to actually getting out of that environment, so there's less distraction, so I can focus more deeply on things. But going back to looking at what's coming out in the next year or so, there's actually very little that I know of that I want. There's a biography of Curzio Malaparte coming from NYRB. There's a collection of Dino Buzzati stories coming from NYRB. There's Leonora Carrington's novel The Stone Door coming from NYRB. You can see an NYRB theme here. I used to have a copy of The Stone Door. I had a Keegan Paul version, which is very rare, and like a fool I sold it on, and now it's worth like £400. But the main thing is it's coming back into print. So what about science fiction? What science fiction will I buy? Well, the fact is, as I keep saying, there's very little happening in science fiction publishing, in the UK at least, for various reasons. As I've said many times, at the moment, publishing budgets for SF and fantasy tend to be in the same basket at publishers. They're not separate things, even though, you know, the resemblance between fantasy and science fiction is increasingly just a historical thing. You know, it's not really an important thing in terms of genre, and hasn't been for a very, very long time. Or even in terms of crossover between writers. Very few writers do SF and fantasy these days. Adrian Tchaikovsky comes to mind, but not many of the contemporary SF writers cross the board in the other way. As I've said before, I think most of today's fantasy writers couldn't actually write science fiction if they tried, you know. So there is that. But that aside, even the sort of specialist sort of science fiction presses like Solaris and Titan are not doing much actual SF. There is a new novel coming from Emma Newman. If you don't know who Emma is, look on the channel, there's an interview with her. It's the first one of hers for a while, and I'm delighted she has a new novel coming. She did say to me when we did the interview, which is over a year ago now, that she was writing a utopian novel. I can't think what the title of the new novel is, but it is coming. I'll try and flash it up on the screen if there's a jacket available to look at. But there's also an Adam Roberts coming next year, and of course we've only just covered the one this year, and the one that's coming next year is called Frankenstein Rex, and it's based on the idea that Frankenstein's monster becomes really powerful, takes over all of Europe, and it's a meditation on power. So that'll be really interesting, because when it comes to recursive SF, when Adam takes the text and sort of draws a metafictional globe around them, a Dyson sphere of metafiction around them, of course he's different to everybody else, because as a fellow of the Royal Society and somebody who teaches 17th, 18th and 19th century culture and art and literature. You know, he really knows his stuff, so it makes a difference. But there's not much else happening. And Emma Newman came to mind this morning when I got on the bus, and this is just a sidebar rant really. Something of hers I keep quoting is a line from her novel After Atlas, which is a great book. And in that, a character says, with convenience, something was lost. And we see this with contemporary technology all the time. We're told it's more convenient for us, but it's actually not. Like, you know, take the global outage the other day, when, you know, nobody could do anything because it's over-reliance on technology. And just getting the bus this morning into Bath, I used my card to tap, you know, my debit card, and I wanted a return, and before I would have got a ticket, they've stopped doing the tickets, so now I have to tap on, tap off, tap on when I get back on and tap off again. Now that's not more convenient for me, that's less convenient, and I don't have the choice. I want a ticket, yeah, maybe that's bad for the environment, but you know, tell that to all the people with 6 kids and more. The fact is this, that, you know, it's convenient for capitalism, it doesn't mean it's convenient for the rest of us. So I'm very determined to use things like cash a lot, that sort of stuff. Anyway, rant aside, so there isn't much happening, and I know this is the case because I was in work the other day, and I read the Bookseller magazine every week, as I always say, and twice a year it does a thing called a buyer's guide. Now, it used to be that thick, and it used to be called the export edition of the Bookseller. I hope you can hear me because there's tons of traffic. This looks like a nice location, but it's everywhere in Bath. Bath's a small city and is surrounded by roads. Anyway, the export edition, the buyer's guide, used to be very thick. It's now 3 volumes, a very, very thin children's one, a very, very thin non-fiction one, and a very, very thin fiction one. And I looked at fiction, and the editorial said, oh, you know, SFF is the big thing at the moment, you know. And then they ran down the sort of 10 or 12 titles that they thought would be the most important titles for the next 6 months or so. And I think maybe only one of them was SFF. So it shows you it's across the genre, as it were, across the genres, across the board, across those markets. But when I looked through the listings, and they're not complete, but they're fairly comprehensive, I couldn't see anything of interest apart from Emma's book. It's nearly all romantasy, a little bit of high fantasy, and sword and sorcery. But a lot of it sounded terribly juvenile. You can tell the copy is written by somebody who doesn't really know the genre. That's always the case with SFF and the Bookseller. The copy is always written by somebody who knows nothing about genre, it seems to me. And really, there's nothing to look forward to. The good thing about this for me is that, you know, as I say, I'm stepping back from collecting, and because of that temptation I get in work, that actually works pretty well for me. So I'm unlikely to buy any new hardcover SF books this year. I'll probably buy Emma's book, that'll be a paperback. But as I said earlier on, the things I'm looking forward to are all from MYRB. And that's not that I've just discovered them. I've been reading this stuff for like, I don't know, coming up to sort of 18, 20 years. But the real point is this, that the action is in reissues and in a biography for me. And, you know, it's just all a matter of taste. And I've got a huge amount of books I haven't read. So I am stepping away from collecting. Another thing on that front, of course, related to the cost, is that I very recently set up a little trip to Paris, which is taking place in September. I'm going for 4 nights with my friend Mark is accompanying me. He's never been before. And what prompted it really was the fact that Michael Moorcock and I have been emailing each other a lot the last couple of weeks and talked about doing an interview. We haven't seen each other for 30 years. We're in touch occasionally online, but it's really good to be back in proper contact with Mike again. And we talked about an interview, and I know he's keen. And yeah, I could do it over Zoom or something, but I really wanted to see him in person because, you know, time is moving on. We're both advancing in years, and I'd really like to see him again because it might be my last chance. You know, that's the thing. I can't go globetrotting. I'm not loaded. So, and he lives some of the time in Texas, some of the time in Paris, and sometime in London. He is in Britain at the moment, but we couldn't make that work. So as I say, I'm going over to Paris. Now that will cost me, so far it's cost round about, let's see, it's not quite £600, and that's before one actually goes and, you know, and eats and drinks and what have you there. So, you know, I've got to sort of think about that and get that covered. So spending in the short term is off the agenda. So this is why I'm stepping away from collecting, all those reasons. And also I've got a huge TBR, I've got a huge number of things to read. So, you know, you won't see a lot of discussion of new SF coming out. So, you know, if you think there's anything that's really of quality, you know, I don't talk about Adrian Tchaikovsky, Peter F. Hamilton, all these people are really popular. I know about this stuff. You know, I sell books, and that's why I got a bit minty, as we used to say, a bit fed up the other day, when somebody who was relatively new to the channel started commenting, and they kept making these remarks like, oh, I don't think you should bag your books, you know, blah, blah, blah. I've been bagging books for decades. I know exactly what I'm doing. You know, it's just really patronizing, and I really, really don't like that. That's the one thing that really winds me up, is when people fail to notice what I've told them, that I've done this for a very long time and that I know what I'm doing. And it's kind of disrespectful, and it's in line with a cultural trend really, which is, you know, ignorance of expertise and ignoring experts, people who know their stuff. I know my stuff. I'm not saying I'm the greatest sort of SF critic in the world. I'm not saying I'm the greatest YouTuber in the world. It's not a question of that. It's a question of relative experience. And, you know, my experience with books is long and deep and wide. You know, it's just that simple. So there's not a lot you can tell me about book collecting, curating, all those sort of things, you know. So when you make a comment on the channel, I assume you're addressing me. There was somebody else a while ago who I knocked off because they kept making posts about Michael Moorcock, funny enough, about his work. And they kept telling me stuff I already knew. And I said to them, look, I already know this. And they said, oh, but other people might not. And I thought, well, you know, that's the thing. They will find it their own way. You know, so don't make a general comment. If you make a comment on a video, something, you know, back it up with evidence and remember, you know, who you're commenting to. That's all I'm saying. And, you know, and 99.9% of you are absolutely fantastic as us, of course. So I got a bit miffed about that, really, as you saw. I have to walk up this huge hill now. It's not huge, but it's steep, so I'm going to shut up, I think. So there's a general moratorium on collecting and book buying for a while. And I'm not saying I'm not going to buy anything, because, you know, I don't want to do those silly YouTube challenges when they're not silly. I can see why people do them, you know, but if self-discipline is rather good, except I'm a bad impulse control. So that's a thing. So I'm not going to do, like, you know, I'm not going to buy any books until I've read another 100, something like that, one of those sort of things. That's not really my character, you know. I don't believe in that sort of, you know, I have to set myself this and that. I do, but they tend to be quiet at different things, and they tend to be internal, you know. It's not something I'd make a public thing, so I'm not doing anything like that. So what are those caveats going to be? Well, obviously, if I come across something for like 30 quid that's normally 300 and it's on the list, then, you know, I'm going to buy it. No, that sort of thing's going to happen. But generally, there is going to be a stop on that sort of thing. And as I say, I think it'll do me good. And, you know, quite frankly, you know, you've got to think about the other financial things and your other responsibilities in life. You know, there's my domestic responsibilities, there's my work, there's the fact I want to get back into writing, which I mentioned earlier on, and I've got some great ideas. One particularly I really want to focus on and, you know, bring the writer part of, you know, the equation back to life a bit more. Because, of course, since I started the channel, my books have been selling better, but there is signs that, you know, Bloomsbury might be dropping them because I've asked for the rights to 100 mystery fantasy novels to come back to me. That's taken a year so far. And, you know, when that happens, that's going to get rewritten, re-edited, and I'm going to issue it myself or through a small press or something. So we'll see. So, you know, stepping back, trying to save some money and recoup my costs against the Paris trip and what have you, that's all an important thing. Also, I'm going to Amsterdam in October, which is all paid for and everything, but of course there'll be sort of costs with that, and that's my holiday with the video widow. So, you know, for these reasons, I should say that now that any plans I've made or things I've said about appearing at sort of book fairs or the vintage paperback show, which will be in November, I think, all that is cancelled. I'm not doing any of that. I'm not going to put myself in the way of temptation, and I won't be appearing, largely also because, you know, the cost of travel to London is quite expensive. I do really need to get to London to spend time with old friends, and I keep saying I'm going to do that, and I haven't got around to doing that, and you can't really fit that in a day with something like the vintage paperback fair. So you're not going to see me at the book fair in Westbury in September, because that's the day before I go to Paris, and you're not going to see me at the vintage paperback fair in November in London. So after that, next year, we'll see. So this is a period of financial consolidation, of really sort of trying to focus things on that. And you know, it's just been really hard as well with the sort of polymyalgia, the illness which I've referred to as well. So that's another factor. So it's a very sort of packed sort of number of reasons. You know, things are always complex in life, aren't they? They're very rarely simple. But it comes down to the fact that I have to be realistic about what I can achieve physically and financially, and, you know, keep everything else going at the same time. Another one of the big questions in any book collector's life is, as they mature, what's going to happen to the collection when you're gone? And recently, Rick McGrath, editor of Terminal Press, the guy who's got the best J.G. Ballard collection in the world, he's passed his collection on to an academic library. You know, he sort of passed it on. It's thousands of items, books, documents, magazines, all sorts of things, the best Ballard collection in the world. And he's 78. And I thought, well, you know, how can you let go, Rick? But you know, you have to let everything go eventually, so you have to think about it. So one of the big questions to me is, when do I stop being a collector and start being a dealer? Does that happen at all? Of course, if I never ever need the money, then that would be different, but I almost certainly will need the money. And I'd like my stuff to go to good homes, you know, and occasionally I do the odd auction on the channel, I sell the odd thing on eBay, and you know, I've always let stuff go, and I've sold stuff online on and off for like 25 years, but I'm not a dealer as such. But of course that may happen. So that's a question. As I get older, I think, am I going to get the value out of this? You know, would it be better to liquidate those items, turn them into cash, and spend more time, you know, seeing the world and what have you, which is a really important thing for me, you know, it has to be said. So here's the thing, to summarize. I'm not giving up buying books altogether. I'm just cutting back a lot. There's going to be a hiatus. I'm still going to be making booktube SF videos and general fiction videos, all sorts of stuff about books and the culture of books and book selling and publishing. But I am just easing off a bit for a while, you know, because I've done YouTube now for 3 years, and the 3rd anniversary show will be coming up in a few weeks' time. Then I'm off to Paris. So, you know, a lot has happened in that time. The collection has grown significantly, and you know, that's partially motivated by book hauls, because you do them because you can, and you know, and they're good for sort of boosting your channel and moving it forward because people love them. But there won't be any book hauls here for a while. So all that aside, now a look at what I have bought recently and what I've read recently. Something I did want to say actually was, again, thanks to everybody who left encouraging comments the other night after I said it, things would get me down and I felt like quitting and stuff. You know, you all brought me back round. Thanks very much, everybody. It's really sort of touching thing, you know. It's astonishing, it really is. Brilliant stuff, and it sort of got me out of that little funk I went into. So I'm going to show you some books now, just after I talk about not buying any, and these are things I've acquired in the last few weeks really, before I sort of set the Paris trip up, which has only been confirmed for a couple of days. And some of these I showed before. I did put up a video briefly for about 24 hours around about a week ago about women in publishing, and really it was just saying that the Bookseller magazine confirmed that, you know, 2/3 of people working in the book trade were women. And I've been saying that for a long time. That's not a bad thing. It was something I wanted to get across. And I didn't want people to think I was complaining. So I took it down because I thought I've talked about this subject a lot. I think I've got the message across that one of the issues in the book trade at the moment is that male readers aren't always well catered for, because sometimes females in the book trade don't understand, you know, what they want. And I think it works the other way as well. So it's absolutely fine. So it's not being critical of women in the book trade. that's one of the best things about it. You work with loads of great women, which is fantastic. But I took it down because I thought, I've complained about this enough, I've talked about this enough, and I didn't want to sort of make it an issue really. So only about 1,000 people watched that before I took it down. And it was interesting, lots of comments from people who I didn't recognise. I think a lot of you regulars didn't see it. So I'm going to cover some of the books that I mentioned in that again, because I did show some books as well. But this is more like a long-term project. This is going to be related to a video and possibly a series of videos I want to do. And it's been on my mind for a while, but it's been sort of focused recently because I've been watching historical dramas on TV. And by that, I've been streaming primarily British films from the 1960s and 1970s of the historical variety, mostly of the Tudor period and Cromwell, because of course you had really great actors then. I like the production quality. They're often filmed at the actual locations, as we still have those locations in Britain, and they're more historically accurate as well. They don't have things like colourblind casting. Now, that's not to bring a racial element to this, but you know, there is a certain distortion of history by too much of that sort of stuff, and I want to stick to what's known, and not sort of create a false impression. I think a lot of people these days, the problem with these things is that it's not about the acting, it's about creating a more accurate picture of history based on what we know. And for people who don't read, they could easily get the wrong idea. You know, this is the thing. Anyway, what is that project? Well, part of it was that I watched, as I say, some Tudor stuff. And Thomas More, of course, was one of Henry VIII's advisors. And Thomas More, of course, wrote Utopia, which I have read. This is a little Penguin hardcover I got a few years back, and I've been meaning to reread it. And the printing and publishing history of Utopia is really interesting. So that's part of it. And I decided to read a biography of Thomas More. This one, The Life of Thomas More by Peter Ackroyd. And this is out of print. We have it in work, so I snapped it up. And I love Ackroyd's work. I think he's fantastic. But I watched A Man for All Seasons, which is a classic film about More, based on the play by Robert Bolt. And I watched Genevieve Bujold and Richard Burton, My Countryman, in Anne of a Thousand Days, which was really good. And I also watched a fantastic film with Glenda Jackson and Vanessa Redgrave called Mary Queen of Scots, which was really good. And it's got me into that. And it does connect to SF, but I don't really want to say how yet, because this is a long-term reading project. By long-term, I mean probably they won't come to anything probably till around about October, because I need to digest this stuff and I want to think about it a lot. And I need to do some rereading of some SF novels. And I hope to get something quite interesting out of it, but we'll see. So I've also picked up Peter Ackroyd's The Tudors, which I'm really enjoying as well. So I am doing some history reading on the side too, and we'll see what comes out of that. Something I showed in that other video, I'm going to show it again. I managed to pick up Let's Go to Golgotha by Brian Aldiss. And I got this it's introduced by Brian Aldiss. And as you see, it looks like a Gollanch Yellow Jacket, but it's actually a Granada A format paperback. I got this for £3.50. Where was I? I was somewhere. I was in Cardiff. I didn't film in Cardiff. I was with two friends. Hadn't been over for ages. Went into Troutmark Books. And I put a few things back and I got this. I've always wanted a copy of this. I remember selling it, and I'm sure there's a B format edition. And I've got the hardcover, and in hardcover it's called The Gollanch Sunday Times Best SF Stories. And twice, I think they did again in 1980, Gollanch and the Sunday Times ran a sort of competition for best science fiction story, novella and novel. And this is the one from the mid-70s, and this features Gary Kilworth's story Let's Go to Golgotha, which is the winner of the shorter category. And I have read it before, not for years. I'm reading it again at the moment. It's a great story about time travel. It's a little bit like Behold the Man and a little bit like Vintage Season by Kettner and Moore as well. And it's really good. And also the two winners for the novel category was a tie between Catchworld by Chris Boyce, who I have mentioned on the channel. I will talk about him properly at some point. I need to reread his work because it's been such a long time. And the very wonderful Shipwreck by Charles Logan, which I did a video about a while ago, which is quite a rare book, but very, very good. So they only did it twice. It's a shame it didn't become a more regular thing, but obviously, you know, what's interesting about this is most of the other writers fell by the wayside. So there you go. NYRB, a book that I've been selling for years and years and years, which I think used to be a Penguin at one point. It's vintage in the UK, and this is an NYRB one, which is Mehmed My Hawk by Yashar Kemal, who was born in Anatolia, lives in Istanbul. I think he's won the Nobel Prize. And this is a story set in that part of the world. And I talked to a friend of mine in work, and he was reading it, and he said, you know, the way we've been selling this for decades, you know, and it's the one Kemal that we always know, that's always been in print. You know, he said it is really amazing. And I said, I've always meant to read it. So I picked it up because he's usually right. So that goes on the long list TBR. Also on that front, I picked up this book, Bosnian Chronicle by Ivo Andrić. This is a print-on-demand edition from Harville. And this was an Apollo paperback for a little while, and Apollo seemed to have ceased publishing. Apollo was an imprint of Head of Zeus, and they only did about 12 books, and they were all reissues. They're really nice. So the rights have obviously gone back to Harville. And again, this isn't somebody that I've read. My friend Mark, decades ago, had a big Eastern European phase, and he read The Bridge on the Drina by Andrić. And Andrić's a Nobel Prize winner as well. Yugoslavia. Do you remember Yugoslavia? Yugoslavia ceased to exist in the early 90s when the war came up. And apparently what this is that it's a historical novel. If you read this, apparently it's the only way you can really understand what's happened in that neck of the woods, in that part of the Balkans, of course they call them, don't they? And I actually said to the same friend who recommended Mehmed Mayhawk, I said to him years ago, apparently this is the thing, you should read it, you probably love it, even though I hadn't read it. And he read it and he said, you're absolutely right. So I've got a copy now, I must get around to that as well. Big tome, as you see. A while ago I showed you a book from the Imperial War Museum Wartime Classics series, which was From the City, from the Plough. And here's another one. This is Mr. Bunting at War by Robert Greenwood. And this has a kind of Orwellian feel, only in that it's got a middle-aged character, rather like George Bowling in Coming Up for Air. And this was the second in a series of books. And this is like a home front thing. And it just depicts this middle-aged man who's got 3 children who are adults. And, you know, they think he's quite fussy, and, you know, he's getting ready, preparing for war and being sensible and what have you. And it's just got a really good late 30s, early 40s feel. And the video we're just reading at the moment, I read a few chapters and really enjoyed it. And it's quite sort of comforting, I guess. But it was made into a film, and apparently his sort of natural stoicism, I think, really becomes the thing and shines through, and there's a kind of quiet heroism, and so I'm looking at that. I really like these books. I am thinking of getting some more at some point when I've got my TBR down. There's a couple about tank battles that look really good, and they haven't been that well represented in bookshops. Imperial War Museum Wartime Classics, great stuff. Now, I have mentioned recently that I've taken up a new hobby, which is playing with model trains. A bit sad, isn't it, really? But I decided I needed a stress buster and something that was different to all the books and cultural hobbies and what have you I had. And I have always been interested in railways, largely because where I grew up, before I was born, the railway shut down. There's literally a station, a halt, as they used to call them, outside my house, and it stopped carrying passengers in 1956-57, and the train stopped altogether in 1965 when I was 2. And, you know, it's a great shame, but I realised when I was older that my life would have been very different had the train still been there. I could have got it to the nearby towns. So my resentment about this has grown and grown over the years. And I have read 1 or 2 railway books, and they can be very boring, but I've recently picked this up. This is 11 Minutes Late by Matthew Engel, and it's a train journey into the soul of Britain. It's all about the British relationship with the train, and I have to say it begins and it's really funny. He's got some really good jokes, and because 11 Minutes Late is a reference to David Nobbs's novel The Death of Reginald Perrin, later filmed for British TV as The Fall and Rise of Reginald Perrin, at this TV series, 3 series, and there were 3 novels as well. There were later ones. There was a 4th one which wasn't very good because the titular character had passed on, and Leonard Roster was in it, and really, really funny. If you've never ever seen The Fall and Rise of Reginald Perrin and never read the books are different to the TV series and are superior, so we recommend them. You can get an omnibus of them. But anyway, 11 Minutes Late is a reference to that, and, you know, he does have some really good jokes, and there's a wonderful opening sequence which I was laughing at, And there's a great closing sequence, but in the middle there's this history of the railways in Britain, which I have to say was a bit too boring for me. I'm not as interested as I thought, but for those of you, if you are interested, I recommend this. He is very, very funny, actually, has to be said. And he's had loads of printing, stayed in print for years and years and years. Finally for today, this is a book which I used to have, and it went out and clear out, and I always regretted it. I looked for a Folio Society edition a while ago. There was one still in a shrink wrap in a bookshop in Tinton that I know, and I passed on it and bought a Ballard there instead. This was about a year ago. I went back there recently and it had gone. And this is Henri Barbuse's Under Fire. Now, the earlier Penguin Modern Classics edition had a still of a French soldier. This was written and published while the First World War was still going on. I think it was 1915. And Barbus is somebody I first read about in a Colin Wilson book, and Wilson wrote about an existentialist novel that this guy wrote called L'Enfer, Hell. And I've read that. Again, I've got rid of that. You know, I should have kept, because it's very uncommon. It was good. This is a really good war novel. I'm going to reread it again one day. It was quite controversial in some ways, because it's rather like From the City, From the Plough by Alexander Barron, which I mentioned earlier. A lot of it is ensemble cast and just depicts the daily life, and then towards the end it really livens up and you get the full horror of war. So if you want to read a war novel, read that. And there will be something coming up on the channel. I've talked a little bit about war novels, and there will be a video soon coming up in which I start to look at some of the war novels I've read. I've not read many. You know, I'm by no means an expert. I know the ones I sell. But the ones I have read have all had a really big impact on me, actually, which is really interesting. And there are 2 or 3 in particular which are sublime. So possibly the next video that comes up will cover 1 or maybe 2 of them. And there's another one which I want to cover in a lot of depth, and I've been holding back on that because that really is quite something. So you'll see that. So anyway, that's what I've acquired recently. So that might be the last sort of book haul for a while in terms of what I've said in this. And I think that's that for now. Thanks for watching. Like, comment, subscribe, super thanks, all that stuff. And as I say, the next video will be looking at a particular war novel or 2, and then we'll get back to the SF very soon. Thanks a lot and bye.